Few know this dark history, a history that has shaped the fate of entire bloodlines on the silent, isolated farms of rural America, the animals most deformed by consanguinity, where incest wipes out entire species. For decades, the practices of consanguineous reproduction have pushed magnificent species to the very brink of functional extinction, anomalies left in their wake so severe they defy our understanding of nature itself. It is in 1953 that our investigation opens, within the isolated mountains of Western Virginia. Here, the Peterson family operated one of the largest applicable horsepower properties in the entire nation. A man of limited vision and the family patriarch, Harold Peterson held a firm belief that he could improve the race through what he called blood purification, the systematic crossing of closely related animals to lock in desirable traits. At that time, knowledge about genetics was extremely limited among rural breeders, explains Dr. Leonard Mitchell, a historian of veterinary medicine at Cornell. Many believed crossing between close relatives would intensify the animal's higher qualities, completely unaware of the devastating biological consequences that would follow. Nestled in a valley surrounded by densely wooded mountains, the Peterson property lay more than 30 kilometers from the nearest town. To Harold, this geographic insulation provided the perfect environment for conducting his experiments without interference or supervision. Even in times of necessity, veterinarians were rarely called, and visitors were seldom permitted. In those early years, the results seemed promising. Stunning coat patterns were displayed by the Appaloosa horses from the Peterson farm, unique spots that attracted buyers willing to pay high prices. But behind this facade of aesthetic perfection, a silent tragedy was beginning to unfold. By 1958, the first foals with visible anomalies were being born. Atrophied front legs, abnormally small eyes, and mandibular deformities were just the beginning. Harold, however, wrote these occurrences off as isolated birth accidents and pressed on with his practice, now crossing animals that were themselves the products of consanguineous relationships. Alarming is what we saw in the veterinary records that survived from that time, says Dr. Elaine Harris, a geneticist specializing in veterinary medicine. Foals with immune systems so compromised they would succumb to common infections within days are described in the notes from the only veterinarian who visited the farm in 1960. Some were born with exposed organs, while severe heart problems in others prevented them from surviving more than a few hours. Between 1960 and 1963, the situation rapidly deteriorated. In the adult horses, abnormal behaviors began to manifest. Some became inexplicably aggressive, while others developed repetitive movement patterns, walking in circles for hours on end or shaking their heads incessantly. It became increasingly difficult for the mares to conceive, and when they could, they often suffered miscarriages or gave birth to stillborn foals. Just another sad, undocumented episode in the history of American animal creation. The Peterson case might have remained, were it not for Raymond Foster. A young National Geographic photographer, he was visiting the region in 1964 for a project on the Appalachian Mountains. Foster arrived at the property by accident when his Jeep broke down nearby, says John Harrison, a local historian and author of the book Secrets of Rural Creation, The Unlisted Stories. How we understand the effects of consanguinity on animal populations would be forever changed by what he witnessed. Although never published by the magazine due to their disturbing content, the photographs taken by Foster documented the result of 11 years of systematic consanguineous crosses. They showed horses with deformed skulls, misaligned jaws that prevented proper nutrition, atrophied limbs, and skins with areas completely devoid of hair. The eyes were the most impressive. Many animals had microphthalmia, where the eyes do not develop completely, or anophthalmia, the total absence of eyes. The complete collapse of a genetic lineage is what Foster documented, says Dr. Paul Whitman, a geneticist at the National Institute of Animal Health. By the time Foster visited the farm, records indicate that approximately 78% of adult animals had some visible deformity, and the foal mortality rate had reached almost 90%. His own responsibility for the situation, however, seemed impossible for Harold Peterson to recognize. In personal diaries discovered after his death, he attributed the problems to external forces, from the quality of the water to alleged radiation from nuclear tests performed out west. That his own reproduction practices were the cause of the disaster, he never considered. Check now to see if you're already subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of our stories revealing the darkest secrets of human intervention in nature. These are truths that few have the courage to face, but that we all must know to avoid repeating the same devastating mistakes of the past. A situation even more serious than Raymond Foster's photographs had suggested was found by veterinary authorities in the state of Virginia when they finally intervened on the Peterson property in March of 1965. Only 67 remained alive of the 143 horses originally recorded on the farm. And of these, only 12 were in a condition considered acceptable by basic animal health standards. Descriptions that shocked even the most experienced veterinarians were contained in the official report, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, who had access to the state archives during her research for the Agriculture Department. There were horses with duplicate organs, incomplete digestive systems, and skeletal deformities so severe the animals could barely stand. That of Midnight Star was one of the most iconic cases documented, a 4-year-old stallion who had been Harold Peterson's pride. The product of 5 generations of consanguineous crosses, this animal possessed a black coat with perfectly symmetrical white spots, a characteristic for which Peterson had intensively selected. From a rare cardiac condition, however, Midnight Star suffered. Instead of 4, his heart had only 3 functional chambers, causing the animal to live in a constant state of hypoxia and fatigue. The fundamental problem of intensive consanguinity is perfectly exemplified by the case of Midnight Star, says Dr. Thomas Reynolds, a veterinary geneticist. Only for the visible characteristic of the coat did Harold select, without understanding that he was simultaneously concentrating deleterious recessive genes that would normally remain hidden in genetically diverse populations. Complex, yet fundamentally clear, is the science behind this disaster. When closely related animals reproduce, the probability dramatically increases that descendants inherit 2 copies of the same harmful gene. The manifestation of diseases and anomalies that would normally remain latent is the result if these genes carry harmful mutations, something common in all species. By genetic diversity, these harmful genes are diluted in healthy populations, explains Dr. Harris. Think of it as a deck of cards. The chance of drawing a specific card is relatively small if you have a complete deck. But if you remove most cards, leaving only a few suits, your chance of repeatedly drawing the same card increases exponentially. This is what happens with problematic genes in consanguineous populations. Alarming levels of homozygosis were revealed by laboratory records from tests performed on the surviving horses, the condition where an organism has identical copies of a gene on both chromosomes received from its parents. While healthy horse populations typically show homozygosity rates between 3% and 10%, the Peterson animals displayed rates between 42% and 68%. With such homozygosity levels, it was not a matter of if genetic problems would appear, but how many and how serious they would be, says Dr. Whitman. The immune system, embryonic development, metabolism, all fundamental biological systems were compromised. To physical deformities, the effects of consanguinity were not limited. Deeply disturbed behavioral patterns among the animals were noticed by the veterinarians. An extremely rare behavior in healthy horses, mares systematically rejected their foals. Self-destructive behaviors were exhibited by other animals, biting their own flanks until they caused serious wounds or repeatedly hitting their heads against the walls of their stalls. The collapse not only of the physical body, but also of neurological systems is what we were observing, explains Dr. James Bradford, a neuroscientist who later studied preserved brain tissue samples from the Peterson horses. Significant malformations in the hippocampus and other brain structures crucial for instinctive behaviors and emotional regulation were revealed by postmortem analyses. The prolonged suffering imposed on the animals was one of the most tragic aspects of the Peterson case. Unable to recognize or accept that his own practices were the cause, Harold refused to euthanize even the worst affected horses. That many severely deformed animals were kept alive for years is indicated by records, unable to perform basic natural behaviors like running, grazing properly, or interacting normally with others of their species. Not only a genetic disaster, but also a monumental ethical failure was the Peterson case, says Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a veterinary ethics expert. A veritable hell on earth for those creatures was created by Harold, by prioritizing his distorted vision of purity over the welfare of the animals. That Peterson had systematically falsified genealogical records was revealed by investigations, to sell consanguineous foals as if they were from diverse strains. Between 1955 and 1963, he sold approximately 200 horses to farmers and breeders in at least 12 different states, spreading compromised genes through a significant portion of the national Appaloosa genetic pool. Far beyond that isolated property extended the impact of the Peterson case, explains Dr. Mitchell. For decades after the intervention, Appaloosa breeders across the country continued to discover genetic anomalies that could be traced back to Peterson's animals. To this day, some of these mutations persist in the breed, albeit at much lower levels thanks to deliberate genetic diversification efforts. While the tragedy of the Peterson horses unfolded in the mountains of Virginia, in Clearwater County, Idaho, an equally alarming, though less documented, situation was occurring. There, in the dense forests bordering the Clearwater River, an isolated community of farmers dedicated to breeding hunting dogs perpetuated practices that would have devastating consequences for generations of animals. Widely unknown remained the history of the Clearwater dogs until 1971, when a recently graduated veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, accepted her first job in the region. What she found would transform her career and our understanding of the effects of consanguinity on domestic canids, says Michael Stevens, author of Lost in Forests, The Forgotten Northwest Communities of America. Mainly formed by families seeking distance from the growing urban development of the post-First World War era, the Clearwater community had been established in the 1920s. They developed their own culture, deeply connected to the surrounding natural environment, living from hunting, fishing, and subsistence agriculture. Central to their subsistence was hunting, for which they heavily depended on specialized dogs. Over the decades, they developed what they called the Clearwater Hound, which, according to local residents, had superior tracking skills, especially for bears and large felines. Foggy are the exact origins of the Clearwater Hound, explains Dr. Robert Thompson, a canine historian and geneticist. An initial mixture of bloodhound, plot hound, and possibly American foxhound is suggested by fragmented records. What we know for certain is that from approximately 1940, the region's dog population became extremely endogamic, with new genes rarely introduced. Proud of its local dogs, the community firmly resisted the introduction of external strains. A detailed system of crosses that explicitly favored breeding between siblings, half-siblings, and cousins was revealed by a notebook found in the old cabin of Elmer Jenkins, one of the most respected breeders in the region. Rarely integrated into the main reproductive program were the few dogs brought from outside. When Dr. Sarah Jenkins arrived in the region in 1971, a canine population in an advanced state of genetic collapse is what she found. In her professional diary, later published in the Journal of Veterinary Ethics, she documented, "The most alarming set of congenital anomalies I have ever witnessed is shown by the Clearwater hunting dogs. With cleft palates are born approximately 60% of puppies, while severe hip dysplasia before the age of 2 is developed by almost 80%. Most disturbing is what the locals call Clearwater eye, a condition where the eyes are progressively covered by an opaque membrane, leading to complete blindness around the age of 4. Upon examining the canine population in more detail, Dr. Jenkins found that virtually all 287 dogs in the community could trace their lineage back to just 6 founding animals from the 1930s. Astronomical values of 43% to 51% were reached by the coefficient of inbreeding, a mathematical measure that quantifies kinship between individuals, while values above 10% are already considered worrying in canine populations. With each generation, the conditions worsened. Litters where more than half of the puppies had cryptorchidism were documented by Dr. Jenkins, and severe spinal and heart malfunctions. Even more alarming was the increasing incidence of abnormal behaviors. Younger dogs exhibit deeply disturbed behavioral patterns, she wrote. Compulsive fixations are developed by many, such as unceasingly chasing their own tails or licking certain objects until they cause wounds to their tongues and gums. Common have become cases of sudden and unpredictable aggression, even in previously docile animals. More worrying is the growing tendency of canine mothers to reject, or in extreme cases attack, their own puppies. The empty look of these animals, who carry the genetic weight of decades of wrong choices, is what I witnessed. If you are watching and feel the same indignation as I do, leave it in the comments. Respect, not interference, is what nature deserves. We need to make this message echo so that stories like these are not repeated. Despite the scientific evidence presented by Dr. Jenkins, her recommendations to introduce genetic diversity were initially resisted by the community. Then 76 and considered the foremost local authority on canine breeding, Elmer Jenkins argued that diluting the blood of the Clearwater dogs would destroy their special hunting skills. A recurring phenomenon in cases of consanguinity is what we see here, says Dr. Morgan. Almost mystical beliefs about the purity of their lineages are often developed by breeders, attributing extraordinary skills to animals that are actually severely compromised. It is a form of circular thinking where any distinct feature, even deficiencies, is interpreted as proof of exceptionality. A critical point was reached by the situation in 1973 when a particularly affected litter was born on a central property in the community. Of the 9 puppies, 7 were born with partial anencephaly, a fatal condition where parts of the brain and skull do not develop completely. Such erratic and potentially dangerous behaviors were developed by the 2 survivors that they had to be sacrificed before reaching 6 months of age. This event finally broke the community's resistance. With the reluctant permission of the local elders, a genetic rehabilitation program was implemented by Dr. Jenkins, gradually introducing healthy external strains while maintaining meticulous kinship records to avoid new consanguineous crossings. One of the first documented genetic rescue efforts in a canine population is represented by Dr. Jenkins's program, says Dr. Thompson. A model that would later be used in several similar cases worldwide was provided by her meticulous notes on the recovery process. Long, methodical, and often frustrating was the process of genetic recovery for the Clearwater dogs. Not only biological challenges but also the cultural resistance that persisted among the oldest members of the community were faced by Dr. Sarah Jenkins. The complex dimensions of the work are revealed by her professional diary, a fundamental reference for understanding this phase of the history. April 1974. Something that gave me hope for the first time in months is what I witnessed today, wrote Dr. Jenkins. 7 puppies were produced by Ruby's litter, the result of an outcross with a bloodhound brought from Boise, all seemingly free from the cranial malformations that had become almost universal here. More significantly, I saw Elmer Jenkins, the most resistant to my intervention, smiling as she watched the pups suckle vigorously, a rare behavior in recent litters. A small step, but perhaps a turning point. Principles that, although known in theory, had rarely been so systematically applied to an isolated canine population were followed by the recovery program implemented by Dr. Jenkins. 3 main components were had by the strategy: the controlled introduction of new breeders, genetic mapping to avoid new consanguineous crossings, and rigorous monitoring of phenotypic and behavioral traits. Notably sophisticated for the time was Dr. Jenkins's approach, says Dr. Catherine Miller, a conservation geneticist at the University of Colorado. A diversity score system based on observable characteristics and known genealogy was created by her without access to modern genetic sequencing technologies. Essentially, advanced population genetics was being practiced by her using only clinical observation and meticulous records. During the first 2 years of the program, 14 unbled dogs were introduced, carefully selected to preserve the functional characteristics valued by the community, such as a keen sense of smell and physical endurance, while diversifying the genetic pool. Detailed records of every birth were insisted upon by Dr. Jenkins, thoroughly documenting physical characteristics, exam results, and observed behaviors. Encouraging, but not without complications, were the initial results. A significant reduction in the most serious physical anomalies was shown by the 3rd generation of outcrosses, with the incidence of cleft palates falling to approximately 12% compared to the previous 60%. However, behavioral problems persisted, particularly tendencies toward hyperactivity and socialization difficulties. A crucial lesson about genetic recovery was taught to us by the Clearwater case, explains Dr. Thompson. Some characteristics, particularly those related to complex neurological and behavioral systems, can remain compromised for generations after the initial genetic pool diversification. This is because many behavioral traits are polygenic, controlled by multiple genes that can remain compromised even after initial interventions. A particularly challenging moment occurred in the winter of 1976 when a severe snowstorm completely isolated the community for almost 3 weeks. During this period, 2 of the main external breeders died in an accident when the roof of a shed collapsed under the weight of the snow. This event threatened to reverse part of the progress achieved, but the community's growing commitment to the program was also demonstrated. February 1976. I was genuinely moved today, wrote Dr. Jenkins. After losing Rex and Sadie in the shed collapse, I feared we would backslide out of necessity. Instead, Thomas and Gerald Jenkins, Elmer's nephews, traveled 42 miles in the snow to reach the nearest phone and contact breeders in Lewiston. They returned 5 days later with 3 new non-related dogs. The community met to cover the substantial costs of the acquisition. "The old ways are dying with us," said Gerald, "but the new ones will live with our children." By 1980, undeniable were the results of the program. To approximately 350 animals had the Clearwater canine population grown, with inbreeding coefficients reduced to an average of 8.3%, still high by ideal standards, but dramatically better than the average of 47% recorded in 1971. More importantly, not only preserved but significantly improved was the dogs' functionality as hunting assistants. That the new dogs were superior hunters was discovered to its surprise by the Clearwater community, says Stevens. With better vision, greater physical endurance, and more stable behavior, they consistently outperformed the remnants of the old lineages in all practical aspects of hunting. This was probably the most convincing factor for the most skeptical members of the community. Clearwater corneal dystrophy, which had previously condemned almost all dogs to progressive blindness, had become relatively rare, affecting less than 5% of the population. To levels comparable to those of normal canine populations, had severe skeletal anomalies been reduced. More significantly, decreased dramatically had abnormal behaviors such as self-harm and impulsive aggression. Finally published in the prestigious journal Genetics and Animal Conservation in 1982 was Dr. Jenkins's work in Clearwater, bringing international attention to the case. A must-read in veterinary medicine and genetic conservation programs became her article, Genetic Recovery in Isolated Canine Populations, the Clearwater Model. Not just the dogs saved in that specific community was the most important legacy of the Clearwater case, concludes Dr. Miller. The practical demonstration that populations severely compromised by consanguinity can be recovered with methodological and patient intervention was what it was. The principles established by Jenkins have been subsequently applied in various situations, from workbirds on the brink of functional extinction to wild populations isolated in fragmented natural reserves. This scientific legacy, however, does not diminish the reality of the suffering experienced by the animals during the decades that preceded the intervention. As Dr. Jenkins herself wrote in her final reflections, a sentient life experiencing unnecessary pain and confusion is represented by every documented malformation, every observed abnormal behavior. True triumph will be when such interventions become unnecessary because we finally understand that diversity is not just statistically desirable, but ethically imperative. While the cases of the Peterson horses and Clearwater dogs may seem like relics of a less enlightened past, the uncomfortable truth is that similar practices continue to occur in various contexts of contemporary animal breeding. Painfully relevant in the 21st century remain the lessons of these historical cases. More insidious is the phenomenon we see today because it often hides under the cloak of preservation or racial purity, explains Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an expert in animal welfare and breeding ethics. In many modern canine breeds, for example, alarming inbreeding coefficients are normalized in the name of arbitrary aesthetic standards. One of the most emblematic cases of the modern era involves the English Bulldog, a breed whose genetic pool has become so restricted that its current genetic diversity is equivalent to what would exist if only 68 unrelated dogs had founded the entire modern race, suggest recent genomic studies. In fact, thousands of bulldogs exist, but with genetic material so similar they actually represent a much smaller number of unique individuals, says Dr. Whitman. A walking warning letter about the dangers of consanguinity is essentially what the modern bulldog is. Virtually all of them suffer from severe brachycephaly, leading to chronic breathing problems so serious that many airlines refuse to transport them due to the risk of death during the flight. More than 80% need caesarean sections for reproduction because the selection for large heads and wide shoulders has made natural birth impossible. To specific breeds or particular species are not limited the genetic consequences of consanguinity. Particularly alarming has the situation become in the dairy cattle breeding industry. That 99% of Holstein bulls used in artificial insemination in the United States can trace their lineage back to only 2 founding animals from the 1960s was revealed by a study published in 2019. A perfect example of how economic pressures can accelerate genetic disasters is the situation of Holstein cattle, says Dr. Frank Anderson, an expert in production animal genetics. Cows that produce impressive quantities, more than 30,000 liters compared to 5,000 from a typical 1950s cow, were resulted in by the intensive selection for milk production, but with devastating consequences for longevity, fertility, and animal welfare. Only 4 to 5 years in production do modern Holstein cows typically survive, compared to a natural life expectancy of 15 to 20 years. So common have fertility problems become that many farms consider it normal for a cow to need 3 to 5 inseminations to successfully conceive, when historically 1 or 2 were enough. A form of genetic extremism is what we are witnessing, continues Dr. Anderson. Animals that are efficient short-term milk production machines but fundamentally dysfunctional as complete biological organisms are what we are essentially creating. Another worrying contemporary example is represented by the case of show Arabian horses. A population where neurological, respiratory, and dental problems have become common has resulted from selection for extreme facial characteristics, particularly the concave profile known as dish face. Such extreme cranial malformations are had by some of the award-winning Arabian horses in large exhibitions that they would have been considered severe deformities just 50 years ago, explains Dr. Wilson. Animals with nostrils so small they dramatically limit respiratory capacity are what we see, and such concave facial profiles that they result in chewing problems and dental malocclusion. All in the name of an aesthetic pattern that has been taken to the extreme. Perhaps even more disturbing is the silence that often surrounds these problems. The genetic consequences of these practices are often minimized or completely ignored by breeders, show judges, and breed associations, focusing exclusively on the aesthetic characteristics valued in the competition circuit. A conspiracy of silence in the world of animal breeding is what exists, says Dr. Howard Bennett, a veterinarian and former dog show judge who has become a vocal critic of modern practices. Behind the scenes, the problems are recognized by everyone. Puppies that die from heart malformations are what we see, adults who can barely breathe, and animals that develop devastating neurological conditions. But publicly, the most extreme specimens are what we continue to reward, perpetuating the cycle. Additional importance is acquired by the lessons from the Peterson and Clearwater cases in the context of wild animals and conservation programs. When populations of threatened species are reduced to critically low numbers, a significant challenge for recovery efforts becomes the risk of inbreeding depression. This phenomenon is dramatically illustrated by the case of the cheetah, Acinonyx jubatus. At least 2 severe genetic bottlenecks have been gone through by the world's cheetah population periods when the population was reduced to such low numbers that genetic diversity was drastically compromised, show genetic studies. So limited genetic diversity is had by modern cheetahs that they are practically clones of each other from an immunological point of view, explains Dr. Samantha Lewis, a conservation biologist. That a single infectious disease could potentially decimate the entire population is what this means, as all individuals share the same immunological vulnerabilities. It is like having a human population where everyone has exactly the same blood type and the same allergies. In alarming reproductive problems does this genetic homogeneity manifest itself. Morphological abnormalities are had by more than 70% of male cheetah sperm, and semen quality is consistently low. Small litters are often produced by females, and significantly higher than in populations with greater genetic diversity is cub mortality. The result of natural consanguinity forced by population reductions is what we see in the cheetah today, continues Dr. Lewis. But that we are deliberately creating similar situations in captive populations of other threatened species when we do not adequately manage genetic diversity is the worrying thing. The irony is that while the negative effects of consanguinity are well documented and scientifically understood, in various animal breeding contexts continue to prevail practices that promote genetic homogeneity. One of the greatest challenges for animal welfare in the 21st century is represented by this disconnection between scientific knowledge and practical application. We know better, but we often don't do better, says Dr. Rodriguez. As powerful warnings should serve historical cases like Peterson and Clearwater, but instead we often repeat the same errors on even larger scales, now with the aid of advanced reproductive technologies. Artificial insemination, for example, allows a single breeder to generate tens of thousands of descendants, something impossible through natural reproduction. When this breeder carries problematic genes, throughout the population is the negative impact exponentially amplified. Even greater are the risks of genetic homogeneity in the age of reproductive biotechnology, warns Dr. Whitman. Its semen may be distributed globally by a popular dairy bull and produce more than 100,000 descendants. If we later find that it carries a problematic genetic mutation, across multiple generations and geographies is the damage already disseminated. Of ethics, responsibility, and our relationship with other species is the fundamental question that emerges from these historical and contemporary cases. A form of human interference in the fundamental biology of other creatures that often results in unnecessary suffering is what intensive consanguinity represents. About humility is what the cases of Peterson and Clearwater teach us above all, reflects Dr. Morgan. That interfering with the basic evolutionary mechanisms that maintain the health of animal populations often results in unintentional but profoundly harmful consequences is what they remind us. A luxury or an abstract preference is not what genetic diversity is. The foundation of health and biological functionality is what it is. Encouraging signs of change, however, there are. New guidelines for breeders of English bulldogs, French bulldogs, and pugs were implemented by the United Kingdom Kennel Club in 2019, aiming to reduce extreme brachycephaly in these breeds. For particularly compromised breeds, outcrossing programs have been started, carefully introducing genetic material from related breeds to expand the genetic pool without losing essential defining characteristics. An excellent example of how we can address genetic problems without abandoning the concept of defined breeds is the Moon for Dalmatian program, explains Dr. Thompson. The high uric acid issue was successfully addressed by introducing a single cross with a pointer, followed by generations of pure Dalmatian backcrossing. In the context of wild species conservation, sophisticated strategies for genetic management are being implemented to maximize genetic diversity in reduced populations. The Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, Canis Lupus Bailei, for example, uses advanced genomic analyses to determine the ideal crossings between captive individuals, maximizing the retention of genetic variation. That preserving only numbers is not enough is what we are finally recognizing, says Dr. Lewis. Functional genetic diversity is what we need to preserve if we want these species to survive in the long run. A true conservation success is not a purely numerical success that results in a genetically compromised population. Fundamental to our understanding of ethical responsibility in animal breeding and conservation remain the lessons of Peterson and Clearwater as we advance in the 21st century. That our power to shape other species through reproductive selection brings with it the obligation to understand and respect the fundamental biological principles that underpin animal health and welfare is what these stories remind us. Not only in the suffering they documented is the true legacy of these cases, but in the lessons they offer us, concludes Dr. Rodriguez. That respect for biological integrity and genetic diversity is not only scientifically sound but ethically imperative is what they show us. Not only by aesthetic or productive goals should our interventions in animal reproduction be guided, but by a fundamental commitment to the welfare of the animals under our care. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. I watched here is what you should leave as a comment so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. To follow our investigations that reveal the darkest and most educational truths about the impacts of human intervention on animal nature, be sure to subscribe. Your like is needed to support this awareness work, and share it with friends and family who need to know these important stories about the consequences of animal consanguinity. A future where respect for genetic diversity and animal welfare guides our practices of breeding and conservation can be promoted together.